The flames reached toward heaven like prayers made visible, orange and gold against the gray morning sky of Paris. I stood bound to the wooden stake in the center of the pyre, rough hemp cutting into my wrists, splinters from the post pressing against my spine through the thin shirt they had left me. Below, bundles of dry wood and pitch-soaked straw waited for the torch. Around me, 10,000 faces stared from behind the cordon of royal guards, merchants and nobles, priests and peasants, all come to watch a knight of the temple burn. The charges still rang in my ears from yesterday's trial: heresy, idolatry, corruption, crimes against God and the crown. All lies. Every word a fabrication born of King Philip's greed and Pope Clement's cowardice. But the truth no longer mattered. The order had been destroyed, its properties seized, its brothers scattered or imprisoned or dead. I was among the last, and I would die this morning not because I had sinned, but because I had refused to confess to sins I had never committed. The executioner approached with his torch, its flame dancing in the cold March wind, and I lifted my eyes to the smoke-stained sky and began to pray. I was born Jean de Villiers, third son of a minor lord in Burgundy, and I took the white mantle of the temple when I was 19 years old. That was 32 years ago, in a world that seems impossibly distant now, a world where the order still held power and prestige, where we were the sword and shield of Christendom, the bankers to kings, the defenders of pilgrims, the most feared warriors in the Holy Land. I served in Outremer for 15 years, fighting in battles whose names have been forgotten by everyone except those who bled in them. I saw Jerusalem fall to Saladin's armies. I watched our great fortresses crumble one by one as the Saracens reclaimed the land we had fought so long to hold. I stood in the harbor at Acre when we evacuated the last Christian holdings, when we admitted final defeat and sailed for Cyprus with what remained of our strength. Those years shaped me, made me into someone I would not have recognized in my youth. Harder, quieter, my faith tempered like steel in the forge of loss and suffering. When I returned to France, I expected to live out my days training young knights, managing the order's properties, serving in the quiet ways that aging warriors serve when their bodies can no longer endure the rigors of combat. I never imagined I would die like this, condemned as a heretic, burned like a common criminal, my name forever stained by accusations I could not defend against because the courts would not hear truth. The destruction of the temple began on a Friday in October, 7 years before the morning I stood bound to the stake. King Philip, whose treasury was empty and whose debts to our order were vast, sent his soldiers to every Templar house in France with orders to arrest every brother they could find. We were seized in our beds, dragged from our prayers, shackled like thieves and herded into dungeons to await interrogation. I was at the Paris temple when they came, serving as treasurer, managing the vast wealth the order had accumulated over 2 centuries. The soldiers broke down our gates at dawn, swarming through the compound with drawn swords, shouting that we were under arrest by order of the king. I remember Brother Guillaume's face as they pulled him from the chapel. Confusion, then understanding, then resignation. He had served in the Holy Land for 25 years, had survived battles that should have killed him a dozen times over, and now he was being arrested in his own house by men wearing the colors of a king we had served faithfully for generations. They took us to the Châtelet, that grim fortress on the Seine where enemies of the crown were held, and there we learned what we were accused of: spitting on the cross, denying Christ, worshiping idols, engaging in obscene rituals. Lies. All lies. But spoken with such conviction by the king's inquisitors that I understood immediately we had no hope of justice. The interrogations began within days of our arrest. They brought us one by one before tribunals of lawyers and priests, men whose faces showed no mercy, no doubt, no willingness to hear anything except the confessions they had already decided we must make. They asked their questions in voices smooth as silk. Did you spit upon the cross during your initiation? Did you deny Christ? Did you worship the head of Baphomet? With each refusal to confess, the interrogation grew harsher. They threatened us with torture, with execution, with eternal damnation if we persisted in our denials. Some brothers broke under the pressure, signed confessions they did not believe. admitted to crimes they had never committed in desperate hope that cooperation might spare their lives. I understood their weakness. We were not young men, most of us, and the months of imprisonment had worn us down, stripped away the strength we had possessed when we were arrested. But I could not bring myself to confess falsely. Every vow I had taken, every principle I had lived by for 32 years rebelled against the idea of admitting to sins I had not committed, of staining the order's honor even to save my own life. So I refused, and my refusal condemned me. They tortured me in the dungeons beneath the Châtelet, in rooms designed specifically for breaking men who would not break otherwise. I will not describe in detail what they did. Some things are better left unspoken, buried in the darkness where they occurred. Enough to say that I learned the full measure of human capacity for cruelty, learned that pain has depths beyond anything I had imagined, learned that the body can endure what the mind believes impossible. Through it all I prayed. When they stretched me on the rack, I prayed. When they burned my feet with hot irons, I prayed. When they did other things I lacked the words or will to name, I prayed. The prayers were all I had, the only weapon left to me, the only way to preserve some small core of self that remained untouched by what they did to my flesh. Sometimes I prayed the Pater Noster, sometimes the Ave Maria, sometimes simply repeated the words of my vows over and over. I promise obedience, chastity, and poverty, to fight for the Holy Land, to defend pilgrims, to uphold the honor of the order. The words became a lifeline, a thread connecting me to who I had been before they broke my body, before they tried to break my soul. And somehow, impossibly, I endured. I did not confess. I held to the truth even when truth seemed the cruelest burden I could bear. After months of torture yielded no confession from me or several other brothers who proved equally stubborn, they changed tactics. They brought us before tribunals not to interrogate but to condemn, courts that had already decided our guilt and needed only to pronounce sentence. I stood before these judges in chains, my body ruined by what had been done to it, my voice hoarse from screaming, and I listened as they read their verdict: guilty of heresy, guilty of crimes against the Church, guilty of corrupting the faithful. The sentence was death by burning, to be carried out in public as an example to others who might harbor sympathy for the condemned order. When they asked if I had any final words, I said only this: I am innocent of every charge brought against me. The temple has been destroyed not for its crimes but for its wealth, not for its sins but for the greed of a king and the cowardice of a pope. I die faithful to my vows, faithful to my brothers, faithful to the God I have served all my life. Let those who condemn me answer for this injustice before a higher tribunal than any found on earth. The judges stared at me in stony silence, then ordered me taken away. They set the date of execution for March 14th, in the year of our Lord, 1314. 7 years after our arrest. 7 years of suffering that seemed like 70. In the days before my execution, I was visited by priests who sought to save my soul. Or so they claimed. They came to my cell with their crosses and their holy water, their voices dripping false compassion, and they begged me to confess, to recant, to admit my sins and accept the Church's mercy. I asked them what mercy the Church had shown to the 200 brothers who had already been burned, what mercy had been offered to the Grand Master Jacques de Molay, who languished still in prison awaiting his own execution. What mercy existed in a world where faithful servants of God were destroyed to satisfy a king's greed? They had no answer for me, these priests. Or if they did, they would not speak it. They simply repeated their entreaties, their warnings of hellfire, their promises that confession would earn me a quicker death, strangulation before the flames could do their worst. I told them I would rather burn clean than live soiled by false confession. I told them my soul needed no saving from them, that I would entrust it to God and God alone, that I feared His judgment far less than I feared the corruption of men who wore holy vestments while doing the devil's work. After that, they stopped coming. I spent my final nights alone in the cell, praying as I had prayed since my arrest, preparing myself for what I knew was coming, making my peace with death in whatever form it would take. The morning of my execution dawned cold and clear. They came for me at first light, unlocking my cell, pulling me roughly to my feet. My legs barely held me. 7 years of imprisonment and torture had left me weakened, aged beyond my 51 years, my body a catalog of injuries that would never heal. But I walked without assistance, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing me dragged to my death like a crippled animal. They led me through the streets of Paris, through crowds that had gathered to watch, past faces that showed every emotion from pity to hatred to simple curiosity. I kept my eyes forward, my prayers silent on my lips, and I thought of my brothers, those who had already died, those who had scattered to distant lands, those like Jacques de Molay who still awaited their own executions. We had been destroyed, our order shattered, our honor dragged through the mud by men who lacked the courage to face us honestly. But we had not surrendered. We had not confessed to crimes we did not commit. We had held to our vows even when those vows cost us everything. That was worth something, I believed. That mattered in some way I could not fully articulate, but felt in my bones with absolute certainty. They brought me to the island in the Seine, to the platform they had constructed for public burnings, and they bound me to the stake while the executioner arranged the wood and straw around my feet. The Bishop of Paris stood nearby, ready to pronounce the final condemnation, to consign my soul to hell in the name of a church I no longer recognized. I looked out at the crowd and I saw faces I knew, brothers who had confessed falsely to save themselves, knights who had once worn our mantle and now wore the colors of other orders, citizens of Paris who had banked with us, borrowed from us, trusted us with their wealth and their lives. Some looked away when our eyes met, unable or unwilling to witness what was about to happen. Others stared with expressions I could not read. And then I saw her, a woman in the back of the crowd, her face partially hidden by her hood. But I recognized her nonetheless. Sister Marie, who had tended the sick at the hospital we maintained in Paris, who had worked alongside us for 20 years, who had been one of the few outside the order to speak in our defense when the arrests began. She met my gaze and pressed her hand to her heart, and I understood that she was offering me what the church would not: compassion, solidarity, the acknowledgement that what was happening here was not justice, but murder, dressed in legal robes. The bishop began to speak, his voice carrying across the crowd, pronouncing my sins, declaring my damnation, calling upon God to have no mercy on my corrupted soul. I barely heard him. My attention was fixed on the executioner, who now approached with his torch, who would soon ignite the wood and straw and send me to whatever awaited beyond this life. I felt no fear. Or rather, I felt fear, but did not let it master me. I had faced death before on battlefields in the Holy Land, in dark dungeons where I thought I would not survive another day of torture. This death would be painful, I knew, perhaps the most painful I could imagine, but it would also be brief compared to the 7 years I had already endured. And when it was over, I would stand before God, and He would judge me not by the lies of my accusers, but by the truth of my life, by the vows I had kept, by the faith I had never abandoned. The bishop finished his pronouncement and nodded to the executioner. The man touched his torch to the straw, and flame caught immediately, spreading with terrible speed, climbing toward me with hungry fingers of heat and light. The crowd gasped, some turning away, others leaning forward to see better. I closed my eyes and began to pray aloud, my voice rising above the crackle of flames, above the bishop's continued condemnations, above the murmur of 10,000 witnesses. The heat struck me first, a wave of it so intense I felt my skin begin to tighten and burn before the flames themselves reached me. I kept praying, forcing the words through lips that cracked and bled, through a throat that filled with smoke and pain. The flames touched my feet and I screamed. I will not pretend otherwise, will not claim some superhuman endurance I did not possess. The pain was beyond anything I had experienced in the dungeons, beyond anything I had imagined possible. But even as I screamed, even as my body tried to twist away from the fire, even as every instinct demanded that I beg for mercy, for the executioner to strangle me as they did sometimes for those who recanted at the last moment, I kept praying. The words came between screams, broken and ragged, but they came. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. The flames climbed higher, engulfing my legs, reaching for my torso, and I felt my consciousness beginning to fracture. reality breaking apart into fragments of pain and prayer, and the desperate hope that death would come quickly, that God would be merciful where men had not been. And then, in that moment of ultimate suffering, something changed. The pain did not lessen. If anything, it grew worse, but it no longer mattered in the same way. I saw beyond it, saw through it, to something on the other side that I lacked words to describe. Light perhaps, or love, or simple presence. God, I believed, showing himself to me in my final moments, welcoming me home. I do not remember the moment of my death. I remember the flames, remember the prayer on my lips, remember the faces in the crowd and the smoke rising to heaven, and then there is nothing. A gap in consciousness, and then I am somewhere else, some place beyond pain or fear or doubt. I see my brothers there, those who died at Acre, those who were burned before me, Brother Guillaume with his kind face and steady hands, Brother Matthias who taught me to fight, Brother Raymond who sang hymns in his rough peasant voice. They welcome me as a brother welcomes another brother who has been long away, and I understand that I have passed through death into whatever lies beyond, that I have endured the fire and emerged on the other side still faithful, still whole in the ways that matter most. We do not speak. There is no need for speech here, but I feel their presence, their solidarity, their affirmation that what I did was right, that holding to truth even unto death was worth whatever price I paid. And I feel something else, something larger than all of us, a presence vast and loving and utterly certain. God, I know, though the knowledge comes not from reason but from direct experience, from touching the hem of a mystery too great for mortal understanding. He knows my innocence, knows the lies that condemned me, knows the faith that sustained me, and in his knowing, I am vindicated in a way no earthly court could ever vindicate me. But that is the end of my story, or perhaps it is the beginning of something new that I cannot yet fully comprehend. Let me return to the world I left, to what happened after I died, to the meaning my death carried for those who witnessed it. The fire burned for hours before they had to add more wood, before my body was finally reduced to ash and charred bone. The crowd that had gathered to watch began to disperse before the flames died, many troubled by what they had seen, by the way I had prayed until the very end, by the accusations I had hurled at king and pope from the stake itself. Some who witnessed my execution later testified that they had seen my lips moving in prayer, even after the flames should have silenced me, that they had felt something shift in the air when I died, some change they could not name but could not deny. Sister Marie, who stayed until the end, who remained after the crowd had gone and the executioners had raked my ashes into the Seine, later told others that she had seen a light rise from the flames at the moment of my death, that she had felt a presence pass through the smoke and disappear into the heavens above. She became something of a champion for our memory, speaking whenever she could about the injustice of our destruction, preserving stories about the brothers she had known, insisting that we had been holy men wrongly condemned. King Philip died less than a year after my execution, thrown from his horse during a hunt, dead before they could carry him back to Paris. Pope Clement followed him within weeks, struck down by illness that consumed him so quickly the physicians had no time to treat it. Some called it coincidence, but others, especially those who had sympathized with the temple, saw the hand of God in these deaths, divine justice delivered to those who had destroyed innocent men for temporal gain. The curse I had supposedly pronounced from the stake became legend, that both Pope and King would be called to account before God's tribunal within a year. I do not remember speaking such a curse, but perhaps I did in the extremity of my suffering, or perhaps others invented it afterward to make sense of what happened. Regardless, the deaths of our persecutors did not restore the order. The temple was gone, its wealth dispersed, its properties seized, its mission ended. But our memory persisted, passed down through the centuries, transformed from history into legend, into myth. We became symbols of steadfast faith, of courage under persecution, of men who held to their principles even when those principles condemned them to death. That was not the legacy I would have chosen, but it was the one we received. I think about the young knight I was when I first took my vows, full of dreams about glory and holy war, about defending pilgrims and fighting for Christ. I think about the battles I fought, the men I killed, the years I spent in service to the Order and to God, and I think about how all of that, all those years of striving and struggle, came down finally to one morning in Paris, to flames and pain, and the choice to remain faithful when faith seemed the cruelest burden I could bear. Was it worth it? Would I make different choices if I could live my life again? These questions torment me less than you might expect. I made my vows with full knowledge of what they might cost, with understanding that service sometimes demands everything, that faith means nothing if it collapses when tested. The fire tested me in ways I could not have imagined when I was young and strong and certain of myself. It stripped away everything, dignity, comfort, even the physical form I had inhabited for 51 years. But it did not strip away my faith, could not touch that core of belief that had sustained me since I first knelt before the altar and felt the Grand Master's sword touch my shoulders. I walked into the fire still believing, still praying, still trusting that God saw my innocence and would judge me justly. That faith was all I had at the end, and it was enough. To those who read this account, who learn of my life and death centuries after the flames consumed my body, I offer this. Faith is not certainty. It is not the absence of doubt or fear or struggle. It is the decision to trust in what we cannot see, to hold to our principles when every rational argument says we should abandon them, to believe that truth matters even when lies seem to triumph. I was not a great warrior, not a brilliant theologian, not a man of exceptional virtue or wisdom. I was simply a knight who tried to keep his vows, who served as best he could, who refused to confess to crimes he had not committed even when that refusal cost him everything. The order that shaped me is gone, erased by men who feared its power and coveted its wealth. But what the order taught me remains, lives on in every person who chooses integrity over expedience, truth over survival, faith over fear. I walked into the fire and I never lost my faith, never surrendered the principles I had lived by, never betrayed the brothers who had died before me or the God I had served all my life. That is my legacy, humble though it may be. That is what I leave behind as testimony that faith, when truly held, cannot be destroyed by any earthly power, cannot be burned away by any fire, cannot be taken from us except by our own choice to surrender it. I chose to keep my faith. I chose to burn rather than lie. And in that choosing, in that moment of ultimate testing, I became more fully myself than I had ever been before. Non nobis, Domine. Not unto us, O Lord, but to thy name give glory. These were my final thoughts as the flames took me. These are my final words to you who come after. Keep your faith. Hold to your truth. Walk into whatever fire awaits you with your head held high and your prayers on your lips, and know that you do not walk alone.